You are listening to the CBMW podcast. I'm Jonathan Swan, your host and the editor for Icon, a journal for biblical anthropology. I am joined by Colin Smothers, the executive director of CBMW, and Denny Burk, the president of CBMW. On today, thank you, Denny, for the AOK. By the way, Denny's wearing a new hat today. It's throwing me off. It's really throwing me off. I'm used to Denny about ready to hit the greens, go golfing, while the rest of us get on with our work life. But today he's wearing his boys hat.
Boys College right here. Standing loud and proud.
Unpaid advertising.
And John, I don't know if we can do this podcast without acknowledging what yesterday was. So happy birthing person day to all of our listeners who are gestation capable, right?
Oh, fie on that hell. We don't want to be talking like that.
No. Happy Mother's Day. A very happy Mother's Day to my own mom, my wife, and to all yours special ladies out there.
Absolutely. In the words of the late, great Mike Shannon, happy birthday to all you mothers out there. All right. On today's show, we do have something real to discuss. Not that Mother's Day is not real. It's a very real holiday. There's a recent report issued by the Department of Health and Human Services titled Treatment for Pediatric Gender Dysphoria. It's a review of evidence and best practices. It was published just a week and a half ago, May 1st, and it was commissioned by Trump's January 28th executive order protecting children from chemical and surgical mutilation. Our faithful listeners will remember that episode. It bans federal funding for so-called gender-affirming procedures. The report isn't giving clinical guidelines. It's rather giving an informative summary of current best practices and the state of research. And so I want to begin just by asking Colin, what's your general reaction to the report?
Well, I think we should acknowledge just what a 180 this is from the previous administration, particularly. You know, Joe Biden had hired a man named Richard Levine, known to the world as Rachel Levine, as the assistant secretary to the HHS, the Health and Human Services Department, the very department that's issuing this report now. Openly transgender person serving at a very high-ranking capacity in the previous administration. Now we have that same department not employing a transgender person, but issuing guidelines that is turning back many of the previous administration's efforts. And going back even further before that, why are we even having this conversation on the national stage? Well, if you look back at the Obama administration and what they were doing back in 2014, back in 2016, issuing reinterpretations of Title VII and Title IX, trying to define sex discrimination along gender identity instead of based in biology. There was that infamous Dear Colleague letter that Obama administration had issued in 2016 that really set the trajectory for and made a lot of even health providing companies sort of bought into this transgender ideology lie. I mean, even in Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, there were baked in proposals and requirements even forcing some of these companies to take an ideological stand on a very, very controversial issue like transgenderism. So I think we should just begin this conversation by acknowledging what a fantastic and really celebratory 180 this is from previous administrations.
I agree. This is so much better. And it also is so illustrative of how theology and ethics is implied in the policies, is undergirding the different public policies that we're facing. And, to put this in very practical terms for parents, if your child comes to you and they say that they're feeling confused about their gender or confused about, well, am I a boy? My body says I'm a boy, but am I really a boy? I feel like a girl, or vice versa. Your child comes to you and says that. How are you going to respond to them? And if you take them to the doctor, what are medical authorities going to say? Well, these policies that have been implemented by previous administration now being undone by current administration, that's going to affect what medical authorities tell you. Many parents, when their child tells them this, they're bewildered. They don't know what to think about it. And so they go to a doctor. And if under the former guidelines, those medical professionals are going to immediately begin to medicalize your child because he or she is feeling a little bit of gender confusion. And where, as in past years, parents would offer guidance and correction And they would say things like, even if you weren't a Christian, they would say things like, Johnny, you have a male body, and the thoughts that you're having about yourself don't correspond to that. Let's go with what your body says, not with, how you're feeling. You're having a misapprehension about yourself. That's what used to happen everywhere, even with people who weren't Christians. Now, you've got this whole ideology that has been infiltrated, not just the culture, but our medical authorities. Mm-hmm. And so our medical authorities, if you take little Johnny to the doctor, what they're going to say is, well, probably what you need to do is to suppress your puberty. You don't want to go through puberty because then your body will really change to be like a male. And if in case you want to have surgery one day down the line, you don't want those changes to occur. And so they'll suppress puberty. They may even put you on cross-sex hormones. And so a lot of what this study does is pushing back on the research into those guidelines that that medical professionals have been telling children for years now to suppress their puberty, go on cross-sex hormones, perhaps have a surgery even as a minor child. And this study is trying to say that, look, the support for those interventions just isn't there. And this isn't really an original study. It's a summary of and a report on a lot of other studies. And when you look at the science that's already out there, it doesn't support these interventions. In fact, it would cause us to exercise extreme caution and actually just a warning not to do these things.
Denny, talking about these studies, we covered the Texas University studies published by Oxford. There's the CAST study in the UK. How should Christians view these studies? So, if you read any of the mainstream outlets, they'll report on this report, and they'll say, well, they're going to say this. However, there are all these other studies and these other organizations who claim that there's good evidence on the other side. Obviously, we don't need these universities to tell us whether transgenderism is a good or a bad thing. But how should Christians view these studies in general? Like, what value do they have for the Christian?
Well, first of all, a lot of these studies are being debunked right now. In other words, they're being shown to have fallacious methodologies and premises. And so a lot of the scientific community is now raising eyebrows at these and questioning them. But your question is, how should Christians feel about these things? Well, you need to think about what is science? What is science doing? Science is the art of making hypotheses and then testing those hypotheses by evidence. That's what they're doing. Now, and science can tell you a lot about what is, about how the world works, how our body works, and all of those things. But sometimes science delves into ideological areas. In other words, they start making metaphysical claims that actually can't be sustained by their own methodologies. So, for example, if you have a human being whose body is organized for reproducing as a father, and then you do a bunch of studies, how do you change that underlying fact? I mean, in other words, that's a fact of nature, and no scientific study can disprove that certain people have bodies that are organized for reproducing as a father, and then another group of people have bodies that are organized for reproducing as a mother. Those are the basic two types of our species, right? I mean, that's just the basic binary that's there. What kind of a study could undo that? It can't undo that. No, what the studies are trying to say is they're trying to say that, look, some people psychologically feel uncomfortable with that biological reality. And the studies are trying to tell you how to respond to that uncomfortable feeling. Now, that's delving into metaphysical claims at that point, because they're basically prescribing that people, okay, if you think about of yourself a certain way, then you are that. Even if it defies your bodily reality, you are that, and everybody else has to conform to it. Oh, and by the way, if your body doesn't conform to the way you're thinking, we'll change your body, and we'll destroy healthy organs, and we'll destroy a healthy reproductive system so that it matches your broken mind. Rather than taking the broken mind and matching it to the healthy body, they break the body. One of the ethical concerns that's raised in this report is that that the current guidelines for transgender care, and I'm putting that in scare quotes, right? because transgender care is not care; it's transgender harm. What they're doing to kids, especially. But one of the ethical concerns raised in the report is that it violates the principle of beneficence and non-maleficence. Now, those are natural law principles, meaning that when it comes to what's right and wrong, you can't try to obliterate nature. You can't try to obliterate the way that something is organized and purposed to work. And, if I came up to you and I put a knife into your heart, that would violate the principle of non-maleficence, right? And beneficence, because I'm trying to stop your heart from beating. Okay. That would be wrong. We would say that obtains in any kind of destruction of healthy body parts. It's not good to destroy a young girl's breasts, which is what they're doing with all of these top surgeries. They're and some of them happening to minor children now. They're giving double mastectomies. You're removing organs. And they tell these kids that, this can be reversed later. It can't be reversed. You can never restore the functioning of a healthy breast. What they mean when they say that is they'll try to build something surgically that looks like it if you change your mind later. But that's not a breast anymore. It's just a cosmetic surgery. And so the whole thing is that science is making these metaphysical claims about what a person is, what a male is, what a female is, and then indulging the misguided fictions that certain people feel about themselves, and then destroying their bodies to support those fictions. That's the problem. And Christians can't be indulgents of fictions, especially ones that are so destructive to people and including children.
Yeah, quoting from the executive summary here on this report, Denny, to your point about the adverse effects of these interventions, it says, quote, "The risks of pediatric medical transition include infertility, sterility, sexual dysfunction, impaired bone density accrual, adverse cognitive impacts, cardiovascular disease and metabolic disorders, psychiatric disorders, surgical complications, and regret." So that's what's happening, observed on the other side of these kinds of protocols that have been adopted really across the board in the United States medical establishment, which I think your average patient, your average parent is assuming that those interventions are based on medical science, tested outcomes, et cetera. But here's another part of the executive summary. Again, I'm quoting. It says, "These protocols were adopted internationally before the publication of the first outcome studies," end quote. What that means is they implemented, and we already knew this, but this is just here in black and white now for everybody to be able to read. They were implementing these things before they were studied, before they even knew what would happen if you did these kind of hormonal interventions, these kind of surgeries. Of course, common sense would tell you that's not going to work out well for you. It's going to only create harm. But they were adopted and then forced down the throats of parents everywhere from even high authorities like the presidency in previous administration, and based completely on pseudoscience, no science at all.
It's ideology. I mean, it's really ideological capture of the medical establishment, and then social contagion is, all these, 4,000% increase in females identifying as transgender or non-binary in some way over the last, decade or so. That's a social contagion. And then you've got this ideological capture of the medical establishment, basically shoehorning these young girls into these identities instead of letting it just resolve. And so it's just been a giant mess. And thankfully, there's public policy now coming out that to challenge all of this. And I'm just hoping that common sense would grip parents, that parents would realize, wait a minute, these medical authorities are telling me to suppress my child's puberty. I don't care what they're feeling. That's not good for them. They're saying that we should have top surgery. I hope parents would say, no, we're not cutting off the healthy breasts of my daughter. We're not going to do that. So parents need to have confidence. I'd say this to Christian parents. Christian parents need to have confidence to understand, look, just because a medical authority tells you that you should be suppressing your child's puberty or cutting off their healthy sexual organs doesn't mean they're right. Okay. They've gone outside of their competency when they start saying things like that. And parents need to be standing in between those corrosive medical authorities and their children when they do that.
Not only should they not be following, these errant medical authorities' advice, but again, quoting from this report, it says the gender-affirming model of care as practiced in U.S. clinics is characterized by a child-led process. Let that sink in. Gender-affirming care in the U.S. is child-led. It's a child-led process, meaning you're just asking, like Denny said, little Johnny, what do you think we should do with your interventions, with your care? And then following the child in whatever idea has entered their heads that day, which is probably going to be different a month or a year from now, as other studies indicate. If I did everything that my children came up with on any given day, it would be a complete disaster. Children need to obey their parents, as the Bible says, and parents need to lead them and raise them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, which means according to God's principles and God's design.
Absolutely. I think what we've seen over the last couple months and couple of years is that the sexual revolutionaries, the LGBT ideologues, have sort of always been coming after kids, right? We're seeing this in the discussion about banning books. They're very angry when conservatives or religious people want to take out books from libraries and schools that are explicit in sexual nature. I've seen materials from schools celebrating Pride, right? There's a different clothing article you would wear for the different day of the week. That's promoting sexual perversion in our schools. And, I was reviewing Trump's executive order here on defending women from gender ideology, extremism, where they defined that there are two sexes. And the number of rescinded articles from the federal government were vast regarding the Department of Education. The number of memos that were sent to instruct schools on how to teach and promote this ideology was extraordinary. I think it was just yesterday that Live Action produced recording from a 16-year-old who called Planned Parenthood wanting direction on how to get testosterone. And they could have it prescribed via virtual appointment. And so, the government and the elites in the medical establishment should be protecting children and guiding children. Rather, it seems, as you just said, we're taking their word and pushing them in dangerous directions. And so, reports like this provide clarity and, of course, truth that's in line with the scriptures that we should all be thankful for. Go ahead, Denny.
Yeah, John, I would just say one thing. There's one part of this report that I want to push back on. I don't want to say that it's, just this totally, unmixed righteousness and wisdom. I don't think it's necessarily that. Now, full disclosure here, it's over 400 pages.
Yeah.
The only part that I've looked at is the executive summary. I didn't read the entire thing. But if you go through it, there is, what they're suggesting instead of invasive, this report is saying instead of these invasive procedures that sterilize children, like puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, and then ultimately, sex change type surgeries. Instead of doing those things, this report is saying children should just, have psychological therapeutic interventions that are, therapy with a psychologist of some sort. I want to push back on that just a little bit. I think that the vast majority of children who are expressing gender confusion basically need supportive parents. They don't need to be in therapy. They just need parents with clarity of their convictions to tell them, hey, God made you a little boy. God made you a little girl. And we live in a broken world, and sometimes our feelings don't match what's real, but we trust God. We trust his word. And we're going to walk with you through this. I mean, most children, that's what they need. Mm-hmm. They don't need to be, put on the couch with a therapist while he, peels his brain away for several years. That's not actually, I think, what the main thing that needs to happen. What needs to happen is parents need to be involved, and they need to have the clarity of their Christian convictions with their children. Because, guess what? In this world, children are going to think all kinds of things. They're going to have problems. And sometimes they may have feelings that are at odds with reality, and parents need to be there to help. So I'm just I'm mainly thankful for this, right? I don't want these physically invasive interventions with children. It's certainly better to have them have therapy that's non-invasive than that. Okay. So it's better than that. I'm saying, though, what's best is for parents to be there, and that the vast majority of these issues will be resolved if parents were there. Say, well, where are you getting that from? Denny, you just pulling that out of the air? No, I'm saying that because there's been study after study that shows if you let these gender confused kids just go through puberty with no psychological intervention, most like 80 to 90% of them resolve. Which means if your parents will just be there, most of it will resolve in the direction of their biological sex. So that's the one little gentle pushback I want to give to this report, and encouragement that I would give to parents.
That's great. Well, thank you, brothers. Until next time, everybody, you can find out more about the ministry of CBMW at cbmw.org.